Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be ranking every single Mr. Olympia version of Phil Heath from his debut in 2008 all the way down to his comeback in 2020. I've actually made a video not too long ago where I ranked all of the Olympia winning versions of Phil, but I thought it would be more fun to take a deeper dive into all of his Olympia appearances in a tier list format. The rankings here are going to go from S plus to C, and I will be considering a whole host of factors. The quality of Phil's physique that year, including things like condition, fullness, shape, and of course midsection control, as well as how dominant or vulnerable he looked on stage. S plus tier is for those all-time great, near perfect, if not perfect looks that completely defined bodybuilding history as a whole. S tier is still elite, just a small step down. A tier represents strong performances that were impressive in their own right, but not quite peak Phil in my opinion. B tier is where we start seeing some flaws or a drop off in performance, and C tier is for the versions that clearly showed he was off or past his prime. Now, before we do dive into it, if you guys are interested in high quality old school lab supplements, you can use my code JakeUltimate or check out the link in the description down below. With that all being said, if you enjoy these videos, a like and sub would be amazing. And without any further ado, let's get into this video. Starting things off, we have Phil Heath's very first appearance on the Olympia stage in 2008. Even though he had technically qualified in years earlier, this was the first time he stepped onto the bodybuilding's biggest stage, and expectations were undeniably sky high. He had already won pro shows like the Ironman and Colorado Pro, and had been compared to a young Dexter Jackson, but people still questioned whether his structure and mass would hold up next to the giants of the open class. And honestly, he proved a lot of people wrong in my opinion. Phil came in at around, I'd say, 235, 240 pounds, with razor sharp condition, that signature fullness in the delts and the arms, and a level of detail that was already ahead of many veteran competitors. His back wasn't quite what it would become later, obviously, but it was still very impressive, especially the separation and the way he controlled it in his posing. He didn't overpower anyone in terms of width, but his muscle bellies and roundness made him pop in nearly every pose. The only real knocks on him this year specifically were the same ones critics had brought up before: slightly narrow clavicles and not quite enough overall width and thickness in the back yet. But as a rookie, placing third behind Dexter Jackson and Jay Cutler is an insane achievement, and it set the stage for everything that would follow. For me, I would say that 2008 would go into A tier. It wasn't peak Phil quite yet, but it was great, a near perfect debut as well, and overall a very impressive physique. He had the great fullness, elite condition, and endless potential, and they all worked together to make the statement that he belonged in the conversation for future Mr. Olympia. Moving on to 2009, Phil Heath entered this show with very high hopes. After an incredible Olympia debut in 2008 where he placed third, a lot of fans expected him to push even higher, maybe even challenge for the title. But unfortunately, this year turned out to be a step back. Behind the scenes, Phil was actually battling a pretty serious issue. I think he got food poisoning the night before the show, and in his own words, he was throwing up all night, he was super dehydrated, and even had a medical team advising him to go to the hospital in the morning. But in true competitor fashion, he chose to step on stage anyway, and that level of dedication is extremely admirable, but it definitely affected his performance. Physique-wise, he was still Phil Heath. He had those three-dimensional delts, the incredible fullness in the arms, and very detailed separation as well. But compared to 2008, he was just ever so slightly off. A little flatter, a little less sharp, a bit bloated in the waist, and at the Olympia level, that's definitely enough to slide down the placings. He ended up taking fifth, which in any other context might seem very impressive, but for someone with his momentum and his expectations, it was a clear letdown. So for 2009, I'm putting Phil in B tier. It was not a bad showing by any means, but he was clearly not at his best. The drop from third to fifth, even with the, health circumstances, shows how competitive the Olympia stage is, and how even the smallest slip-up can definitely cost you. Now, 2010 was the year Phil truly came into his own. He had already established himself as a top contender, but this was the season where he looked like a future Mr. Olympia, not just in potential, but in actual execution. Earlier in the year, he took a highly controversial second place at the Arnold Takai Green, and a lot of fans and even some judges believed that Phil should have taken the win. He was sharper, more complete, and had that signature 3D pop that was starting to really define his look, especially at that prejudging, but he did fade at the finals. By the time the Olympia rolled around, Phil showed up in arguably the best shape of his career up to that point. He was ridiculously full, round, and sharp, with muscle bellies that looked like they were going to explode. His condition was also razor sharp, as I mentioned. The shredded glutes, etched hamstrings, detailed abs. There was really no weakness in his physique aside from, I would say still clavicle width. He definitely did not have the sheer frame size that Jay Cutler, who eventually would win this show, brought to the stage, and that likely played a major role in the final decision for why he placed second. That said, the biggest criticism this year was undoubtedly Phil's midsection control. As full as he was, there were moments where his midsection would lose a bit of that, control and tightness, and in a lineup that was very competitive, it gave Jay Cutler the edge. Still, placing second behind a reigning champion like Jay, and doing so with such a dominant look, made it clear that Phil's era was right around the corner. So for me, I would say that 2010 Phil Heath lands in A tier. This was a statement year. He didn't win, but he looked like a future Mr. Olympia in the waiting, and this version could have easily beaten some of the other past champions. 2011 was the year Phil Heath arrived not just as a champion, but as one of the greatest physiques the sport has ever seen. This was his first Mr. Olympia win, and in hindsight, it might still be his best. A lot of people, myself included, consider this to be one of the most complete and aesthetic physiques in the entire history of bodybuilding. It truly was that good. Every single detail on his physique was locked in. His midsection, which had been a bit shaky in earlier years, was now perfectly controlled, tight, crisp, and a non-issue throughout the show. His condition was also elite from head to toe. Grainy detail in the legs, strided glutes, shredded hamstrings, and insanely separated quads. His upper body as well was unreal. The trademark roundness and separation in his arms, delts, and even the back made him look far wider than his structure would suggest, obviously, which helped minimize any width disadvantage compared to someone like Jay Cutler. His back was also at its best up until this point. It was thick, wide, deeply etched, and complete from traps all the way down to the glutes. It was clear that he had been working to bring up that area, and it paid off in a huge way. Jay Cutler, who placed second this year, came in with a torn bicep that visibly affected his shape. There was noticeable bruising and disfiguration in his arm, and even more importantly, his back showed signs of even more atrophy, especially when compared to Phil's incredibly full, detailed, and complete rear double or rear lat spread. It was a changing of the guard, and no one could deny it. This version of Phil Heath is a definitive S+ tier. It was his most complete and balanced look in my opinion, with zero weaknesses, flawless presentation, and a clear victory over a multi-time champion and legend in history. Coming off his iconic win in 2011, Phil Heath returned to the Olympia stage in 2012 as the reigning champion, and while he definitely brought a winning physique, there's no doubt about that, this version tends to get a little bit overlooked. That's partly because it's sandwiched in between two of his best years ever, the flawless 2011 and the very dominant 2013, which we will look at after 2012. But make no mistake, 2012 Phil Heath was still incredible. Compared to the year before, Phil came in a bit fuller, I'd say, which gave him that signature roundness and pop in the arms, delts, and chest, but it may have come at the slight expense of detail. His condition was not off by any means, but in some areas like the lower back and the midsection, it didn't have the same definition that we saw in 2011. The abs weren't quite as sharp or tight, I would say, as well, and the separation in the entire physique just looked a bit blurrier than his previous Olympia win. That said, his midsection was still completely intact, his muscle bellies were insane, and he continued to display one of the most complete physiques of his era. He had no glaring weaknesses, and his stage presence was extremely confident as well. So, even if he didn't reach the absolute peak that he hit the year before, this was still a physique that held off a really good Kai Green and solidified Phil as a two-time Olympia champion. For all of that, I think I would place 2012 in S tier. It might not have been perfect, but it was still a very elite version of Phil, dominant, complete, and more than deserving of his second Sandow. Just not quite on the same level as his 2011 masterpiece, but still, that's a very hard bar to pass, and it's still a very respectable physique in the grand scheme of Phil Heath. Moving on, we have 2013, and this was the most dominant version of Phil Heath that we ever saw, plain and simple. While 2011 might still be the most perfectly balanced version, 2013 was his most overwhelming. He stepped on stage bursting with fullness, sharp as a razor, and looked completely untouchable from the moment he hit his first pose. This year, Phil pushed the absolute limit of how full he could be without sacrificing that condition, and he definitely pulled it off. His delts looked like cannonballs, his arms were insane, and the muscle maturity and density in his entire physique had clearly leveled up. The detail in the legs, the striations in the chest and glutes, everything popped. It was clear the moment he stepped out that nobody else was in the same league, and from what I remember, they barely even had to compare him in the callouts. That's how far ahead he was. Now, if we're going to nitpick here, and we kind of have to at this level, his midsection was just slightly distended. Not bloated or uncontrolled, but definitely not as tight or streamlined as it was in 2011. That's the trade-off you have to make when you're pushing for extreme fullness, and it definitely showed a little bit in the transitions, as well as certainly in some front poses. Still, that's really the only thing you could point to, and even then it was not enough to make anyone question the outcome. So this version of Phil Heath would go straight into the S+ tier, joining that amazing 2011 display. The physique was complete, the condition was elite, and the level of dominance he displayed this year was untouchable. It was the clearest win of his Olympia run in my opinion, and not even the slightly worse midsection can make it any less than that S+ tier. 2014 marked Phil Heath's fourth straight Olympia title, and while he technically kept the crown, this was the first year where serious cracks started to show. The competition was tight, the energy was intense, and the rivalry with Kai Green was at full force. This was the infamous year where the two had to be physically separated on stage during the posing, and honestly, the battle between them was closer than ever. Physique-wise, Phil was still bringing insane muscular fullness. His arms, delts, and chest were all as freaky and as round as ever, but the problem here was that everything else felt slightly off, especially by Phil's own standard. His midsection was a recurring issue here, and while it was not completely blown out, like in later years, it was definitely not tight or streamlined at all. Additionally, his overall look lacked that etched detail and dry hardness that made 2011 or 2013 so dominant, and you could just tell that the condition wasn't quite as sharp. All of Phil's flaws left the door wide open for Kai to push him harder than ever before, and Kai did just that. Many people thought Kai Green had a legitimate shot at winning this one. He brought a grainy, conditioned look and seemed to really push Phil in certain poses. But ultimately, the judges still gave Phil the nod, mainly due to his rounder muscle bellies and overall shape, I would say, but also maybe it's because Kai Green lacked that total, complete development when assessing each entire pose. For example, his forearms were kind of weak, and in a pose like the rear lat spread, his entire back kind of flattened out. Regardless, though, this win did not feel like a decisive victory for Phil, and that definitely hurt the perception of this version. For that reason, I'm going to place 2014 in B tier. He still looked great by most standards, but compared to his previous versions, this one did not deliver the same wow factor. Between the midsection issues and the rising tension, and obviously the closeness of the result, I would say, this was the start of Phil looking more beatable. Next is 2015, another underrated year, but one that should not be overlooked. After all the criticism he got in 2014 for his bloated midsection, Phil Heath came into the 2015 Olympia with something to prove, and he definitely delivered. This was a clear bounce back year. Kai Green was out of the lineup, which meant less drama on stage, but it also meant all eyes were on Phil to see how he would respond. And to his credit, he showed up sharp, composed, and looking far more refined than the year before. The biggest improvement was his midsection, in my opinion. In 2014, it had been the main knock against him, lacking control and throwing off his symmetry. But in 2015, it was definitely locked in. His abs were tight, the waist was streamlined, and the bloat was completely gone. It was clear that he made it a priority, and the difference was night and day. Now, some people really point towards the fact that he looked flat at this Olympia, a lot flatter than his usual self at least, and that's true to a certain extent. He wasn't as bubbly as he had been in 2011, 2013, or even 2014, for example, but the classic Phil Heath 3D muscle bellies were still very much there. Even at slightly reduced fullness, his arms, delts, and legs were still standout features that nobody else in the lineup could match. And from behind, he was still as dominant as ever, arguably the best back double in the game, and here was no different. With Kai Green out, the real competition came from Sean Roden, Dexter Jackson, and Dennis Wolf, but none of them could really match Phil's combination of detail, balance, and presence. Once again, he looked like the rightful champion, with nobody else really coming close. For me, I would say that 2015 lands comfortably in S tier. It was not quite peak Phil Heath, but it was a disciplined, polished look that showed he could take feedback, make adjustments, and still win very convincingly. By 2016, Phil Heath had firmly cemented his place at the top of the sport, claiming Olympia title number 6. And once again, he looked very dominant. There was no real doubt about the outcome of the show. Phil was just simply too complete. His muscle bellies were still on another level, his structure remained balanced, and from behind, he continued to set the standard. No one else in the lineup, whether it was Sean Roden, Dexter Jackson, or Big Ramy, had the full package to match him. From a distance, it felt like business as usual for him. He brought great fullness, solid separation, and that signature 3D pop that made him so hard to defeat. But when you looked closer, especially compared to his earlier showings, you could start to see some subtle issues creeping in. The biggest one was definitely his midsection. While it was never super out of control, the distension was definitely noticeable here compared to previous years. It showed up in the transitions, and in certain front poses his stomach did not look as tight or streamlined. It wasn't enough to cost him the win, not even close, but for a guy whose physique had once been praised for its near-perfect flow and aesthetics like in 2011, it definitely stood out. So even though 2016 was still a very dominant version of Phil, and he was clearly better than the lineup, the visible setback in his midsection control is what holds this version out of the very top tier. I think I'm going to have to put 2016 in A tier. He was still the champion, and deservedly so, but the standard that he set for himself in the years prior was just a little bit higher, and therefore he didn't match it in my opinion. Now, 2017 was a wild year for Phil Heath. On one hand, he won his 7th straight Mr. Olympia title, tying the all-time great Arnold Schwarzenegger and extending one of the most dominant reigns in bodybuilding history. On the other hand, this was also the version that stirred the most controversy, and almost all of it came down to one thing, obviously his midsection. Let's start with the good, which was really everything else. Honestly, outside of the waist, this might have been the best Phil Heath we ever saw. His legs were absolutely massive. They were full, shredded, and separated, and just insane, especially the quads. His arms and delts looked like they were sculpted out of granite, and his back just layers upon layers of muscle. From a muscularity standpoint, it was almost cartoonish how dense and full he looked. Every pose hit very hard, and every angle popped. But the midsection was a real problem. Whether it was from pushing the fullness too far or some other underlying issues, Phil's waist did not look under control. In certain shots, especially during the transitions and the relaxed moments, the distension was very noticeable, and that's what held this version back. It did not ruin the physique completely, but it absolutely distracted from what was otherwise a potentially all-time great look. So for 2017, I think I'm going to have to put Phil Heath in A tier. He was still dominant, but, Big Ramy pushed him hard, but Phil here was just too complete in my opinion, yet the glaring midsection issues keep this version from joining the elite company of anything above A tier. One of the best physiques ever, especially of all time as well, just with one major flaw. 2018 marked the end of Phil Heath's legendary Olympia run, and while it was not a total collapse by any means, it was the version that finally got dethroned. After 7 straight Olympia titles, Phil was aiming to tie Ronnie Coleman and Lee Haney with 8 straight wins, but Shawn Rhoden had other plans. To be fair, Phil still looked very good. His grainy condition and muscle maturity might have been at an all-time high. His back was also still top tier, and maybe at its best as well, and his arms and delts were freaky as always, and the legs, especially from behind, were thick, full, and cut. It was clear that Phil still had the mass, the roundness, and density to win, but once again, and maybe more than ever, his midsection was the glaring flaw. It was arguably worse than in 2017. During the transitions, in the relaxed shots, and even in some mandatory poses, Phil looked like he was constantly out of breath and letting his gut hang out. It was almost as if he did not even know it was just hanging like that. There was a visible lack of control, and in a head-to-head, matchup with someone like Shawn Rhoden, who brought an incredibly tight waist and flawless presentation, that was enough to tip the scales. The contrast between the two could have not been more striking. Phil was still a mass monster, but Rhoden was aesthetic, poised, and sharp. It wasn't just about who had more muscle, it was about the total presentation, and Phil's waistline broke up the flow of an otherwise complete physique. So for 2018, I think I would have to put Phil in B tier. He still brought an Olympia-worthy look, and his second place finish was extremely polarizing, but the lack of midsection control finally cost him the title even in the judges' eyes. It was a strong performance, just not enough to hold off arguably the best version of Shawn Rhoden. Finally, for the last version of Phil on the Olympia stage, we have his 2020 comeback. After taking a 2-year break from competition, he made his long-awaited return, and there was a lot of hype going into this one. Fans were wondering if he could tie Ronnie and Haney at 8 wins, or at least deliver a performance that rivaled his former greatness. But once he stepped on stage, it was very clear that this was not the same Phil. To be fair, he still looked very respectable. You cannot have that much muscle maturity and density built up over years of dominance and not stand out. His arms and shoulders were still amazing, and some poses, especially the most muscular, reminded us of why he's a 7-time champion. But overall, this was a smaller Phil Heath. His back had lost some size and overall impact, especially when compared to his prime. His legs, particularly from the side and back, lacked the detail and the sweep that we were used to seeing. And once again, the midsection was a major issue. He looked uncomfortable in transitions, and there were moments where he appeared out of breath and let his stomach hang out. After all the talk about coming back better than ever, the end result did not match expectations, especially when looking at the midsection. Phil ultimately would take 3rd place, and honestly that felt fair. He still beat most of the lineup on, condition and muscularity alone, but he no longer had that Olympia champion aura, and the weaknesses, especially in the waist, were too hard to ignore. So for 2020, I think I'm going to put Phil Heath in C tier. For many competitors, having Phil's C tier physique would be a dream. However, compared to his prime, this placing feels right. It was a solid effort after 2 years away, but well below the standard he set for himself over all the years of Olympia dominance. Well guys, that about wraps it up for this tier list of every Phil Heath Olympia version. From one of the most dominant physiques of all time to a respectable finish, it's been an incredible run. Who knows, based on how big Phil Heath looks these days, maybe I'm going to need to remake this tier list someday if he shocks the world with another comeback. Probably won't happen. Would I want to see it? Yes. I'm sure all of you would, but obviously it's probably not going to happen. Until then though, hopefully, let me know how you would rank each version, and with that all being said, I will see you all in the next one. Thanks for watching.